Welcome to the North Carolina Botanical Gardens annual and 15th Darwin Day Lecture. I'm Johnny Randall, Director of Conservation here at the Botanical Garden. And for those of you new to the Botanical Garden, we are a conservation garden and a unit of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So before we go any further, I'm going to read what we have developed as a lands acknowledgement for our Botanical Garden. So the North Carolina Botanical Garden and the North Carolina Botanical Garden Foundation acknowledge that the story told about the history of the land we steward has been incomplete. Before the Morgans and Masons, these lands were home to multiple tribes and the ancestors of the Occaneechi band of the Saponi Nation, who are thriving locally this day. We celebrate the Native people today, including many UNC students, faculty, and staff who still gather, walk, hike, and engage with the habitats and gardens of this land. We recognize that at least one of the adjacent lands we steward, the Mason Farm Biological Reserve, was first cleared, cultivated, and worked by Native Americans and later by the enslaved people of African descent. We invite you to reflect on our individual and community roles in knowing the whole story about the land that we steward. I wanted to mention that, this is Abraham Lincoln and Darwin's birthday, born on the same day in 1809. But Abraham Lincoln would be amazed at the strides we have made in racial equality, but would also be equally dismayed at how racial injustice continues. So this is kind of a tragedy. And Darwin would be thrilled over the advances we've made in the study of evolutionary biology, but I think he too would be dismayed at the current level of science denial. But tonight, we have a wonderful evolutionary biologist and botanist and scholar that is going to talk with us about oaks and their hybridization. So thank you, Paul, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out. Hi, everyone in Zoom land. Welcome to Oaklandia. Really great to be here. So I wanted to start out just getting us to think about Darwin, some of these drawings that he put together that are, little hand drawings that are interesting. Some of them look like the first evolutionary trees. I'm going to focus on evolutionary trees to give you some context to appreciate some of the things I'll talk about. We'll move on here. Okay, we have this. So I had this preloaded. I didn't know that Johnny was going to say anything about it, but the important thing to remember is that if you were born after 1980, President's Day is a shopping day. So we've lost track of when Abraham Lincoln has his birthday. It's February 12th, 1809. So two individuals sharing that birthday. There they are with their party hats. And back to oaks and what I want to tell you about today. The idea of thinking about evolution from part of Darwin's mindset was clearly that lineages split and they diverge into other species, descent with modification through time. And this was something that appeared in his Origin of Species. And there's only one figure in the Origin of Species. And it's this little evolutionary tree right in the middle here. And what it's supposed to show you is just lineages through time. This is deep time here. Whoops, sorry about that. Going through up to modern time. And some of these lineages go extinct. Some of them diversify. And so Darwin was on top of that, and he laid it out for many people to think about. The challenge was, how do you actually reconstruct the past? And so we've come a long way, and I'll be using DNA sequence data to show you some of the advances I've made in studying oaks. But the idea of these trees is sort of taken over, proliferated our world of thinking, using them to understand traits, using them to understand when lineages split through time. This is really advanced to a level where it's become, almost like an afterthought, but it's really quite an advance in the last 30 years. So I'm calling this a circus because I think when you consider oaks and just how many rings of interactions they truly have. There's a giant big top when you think about oaks. And under it are the oaks with their interactions, species to species interaction, oaks with their interactions with other biota. And then the idea of oaks setting the table for a lot of different organisms. It's quite a play that they've sort of orchestrated. And I'll give you the history of how that's come about with a few examples, including some ideas about how they became so successful. So this is a little bit of a 2,000-year history thinking about oaks and Western society. And we can go back to Pliny the Elder, who commented about how during really hard times, poor people were sustaining their lives eating acorns. Then we move into the Roman world, where if you wore the corona civica, it meant that you made a great sacrifice to save people in Rome from, enemies. So you wore the crown, and that's Augustus wearing the corona civica. Moving into medieval times, it seems that you couldn't really do anything in the medieval world without using oaks. They were part of the society. So this is heraldic times here in the middle. And this is sort of the coat of arms for a town in Spain. And that town is called Albuquerque. Basically means white oak. We've got an Albuquerque as well. So this is in Spain. You get the tree of life symbol. And of course, there's our tree of life, if you want to think about the angel oak. That came up a little early for me on this. But the point is, from those times to symbols that have carried on from Europe to here in the US, where we're still using the pedunculate oak, Quercus robur, on the back of our currency as a symbol of strength, immortality, fecundity, you name it. And then the great transition from European oaks to the white oak, and that's what we have with Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, and the boards that were used made of white oak that could repel cannonballs, as people talked about it. So lots of interactions between humans and oaks. These are some of my colleagues in Raleigh. They're taking a few measurements for a study we were doing. They did pretty good work. But if you really want to know about the big acorns, these are the two species. Quercus macrocarpa from the central Midwest, it means big fruit. And then from Central America, Quercus insignis, and insignis means remarkable. Those are the two largest acorns in the range of Quercus, just so you know. Now, it's not that easy. Acorns, you think oak. Well, in my world, and at least according to some things we now understand better, there are multiple groups in the oak family that make acorns. So it's really pretty hard. So, will the real acorn please stand up? It's not that easy. So there's three origins at least from something like a chestnut ancestor, where there's three nuts in a cup. You lose the two lateral nuts and you move to a circular fruit. Obviously, natural selection is driving this. That single seeded nut within a cup is really got some advantages. It's popped up at least 3 times. This group, Lithocarpus, has about 300 species. The oaks have about 435. So something to think about is, what is an oak? So, it's really acorns, leaves, good. There's things about oaks that are important and we all understand them, but it's not that easy. Here are 4 species that we now know to be each other's closest relatives, and their leaves are incredibly different. So we see that oaks vary in their leaf morphology when they're really closely related. So there's a lot of change even among a very closely related group of red oaks from the Southeast. So back to the question of what's an oak. And this pretty much is the technical definition. We've got male flowers that bear pollen arranged in catkins, and female flowers produce an acorn seeded in a cupule. That'll do it, but you need the combination to be straight on that relative to some of the other members of the oak family. And then this helps too, because these leaves are always oaky or oaksome or something like that, right? And we can recognize these lobed forms or these shallowly lobed forms as Quercus, and it all makes good sense. So there's something out there, the gestalt of Quercus. And boy, it's bewildering in terms of how much diversity in habit and in habitat. On the left, we've got the huckleberry oak. It lives under snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. It's a low-growing oak under coniferous overstory. Subtropical oaks in the lower left from Mexico, they're covered in epiphytes. There's more of other stuff up in the canopy than oak leaves. Tropics, oaks with entire margin leaves and furry cups. I mean, that's pretty bizarre. Sorry. And then coming back to something we were grounded with, a good deciduous white oak species, Quercus margareti, the sand post oak. And I'll turn the corner here and come down to an oak in China that's got a really standard laurel looking leaf. It looks like some of the oaks from here. It's in a totally different group that is strictly Eurasian. And then a couple of interesting things here. The frilly cup of Quercus ithabarensis, probably the first oak that our ancestors ate when they came out of Africa, found in the Middle East, red oak, and a white oak from California. So lots of diversity to think about in terms of habit, habitat, and where we find them. So part of what I want to get into is my first vignette is on the geography of plants. And this is the first paragraph from the Origin of Species. And if you read it, it's all about the distribution of organisms and thoughts about geology. First paragraph, this is it. So Darwin is already thinking that the distribution of organisms is not random. There's a pattern out there, and biologists like myself and Alan, we like to look for patterns out there. And so Darwin and Wallace, these individuals were pattern seekers, looking to see what these distributions sort of measured up to on geological space. So biogeography is a field that I'm really interested in, and it's the study of geographic distributions of organisms. And it's really an interesting study because it takes all available evidence to come together to think about how do we explain a distribution of species. And there's Wallace and Darwin together, looking like aging rock and rollers. So what about Quercus? They've been around for 50 million years. This fossil's not that old, but this is certainly an oak acorns. It's about a 20 million year old fossil. So the oaks have had a long presence here. There's opportunity that was knocking for the oaks with respect to some of the changes that were taking place in the climate in deeper time. Things were getting cooler. So if you come into the last 35 million years, it's just getting cooler and cooler as we got out of the Eocene period. So paleoclimate is now shaped to be perfect for oaks that enjoy seasonal climates. And that's what we see reconstructed by people who understand this stuff. And then it's time to appreciate the distribution of Quercus. So here's the global distribution. And you don't have to be a biogeographer to say, boy, the oaks are a northern hemisphere group. You might be thinking, well, where did they really come from? That's another question. Look at how they've shaped that distribution. They've put their toe into northern South America, crossed Wallace's line into south parts of the Malayan archipelago, a little bit of North Africa, but they are clearly across the temperate zones, those repeated biomes that we see in the northern hemisphere. And to make this even clearer, we can look at the distribution of oaks and then put up annual rainfall in a global sense, just to see the sweet spots of what oaks are responding to. And it's really right where we are, these shades of green. And if you look at the scales here, we're in that 38 to 50 to 60 inches of rain a year. So oaks are shaped by rainfall and to some degree temperature. They've done okay. If you look at the distributions, they've done okay in the Southwest and into the Mediterranean zone of California. They've also done pretty well in the Mediterranean zone of Eurasia. Sweet spot again throughout Western Europe, and then another sweet spot here in Southeast Asia. So they're shaped by a few factors, temperature and precipitation, and that's not unusual for temperate deciduous plants. So oak diversity right here in the Americas is an interesting thing to look at because you get a good feel for how many oaks we've got east of the Mississippi, what's up in California where they hold oaks in high esteem, Southwest, down the spine of Central America, all the way into the one species that occurs in South America. So we think about this as an interesting problem because why are there so many oaks in Mexico? And it's just one of those things. But if we want to feel good about oaks right here, we can think about the oaks of the Piedmont and coastal plain. The warmer colors of this map are where there are more species. The blues are cool, fewer species. And you can see that the Piedmont and coastal plain is a biodiversity hotspot for Quercus species here in the United States. So that's our perspective. We've got 92 species in the US. And the interesting thing is the diagram on the left was based on a tree survey of forest plots. They didn't really care about the shrubs. There's 30 species of shrubs in the United States. These are the things that most foresters don't count as plants or anything, right? They're mostly, sort of shrublands. So anyway, shrublands are really critical habitat for Quercus, and we know that and we appreciate it because they bring a lot of ecosystem services with that as well. So it doesn't have to be the tree form that we appreciate. So here's what we've got for the Americas. We've got these 5 groups, and I'm using common names here because I think you can relate to them. The white oaks, more of those than anything else. Red oaks, second. The live oaks we know from our southeastern contact, Quercus virginiana, and other parts of Florida have some live oaks. The golden oaks are out west, and there's one deer oak species out in the Pacific Northwest to Northern California. So that's the table, and I'm going to pretty much set this up as a white oak and red oak exercise. So that's where I'm going with the studies we've done. And one question to think about is Mexico the cradle or the museum for oak diversity? The museum would be that they've been there a long time, and with time, there's become this, sort of bolus of species, lots of speciation. Or did they get there recently and diversify like crazy in an opportunistic way? So these are just a simple way of posing this distribution where Mexico has really got a lot of species compared to the rest of the Americas. So I'm going to go through this exercise because we did a study studying the diversification of Quercus, and we analyzed on a grid as much of this as we could bring in, looking at bioclimatic data, soils, leaf habit data, with the focus really on reds and white oaks. That's really what we were after. So we did a decent job sampling. And of course, I'm just going to give you the highlights of this, which are about the sequence data, because they yielded a really interesting pattern. So the rest of this is an interesting way of thinking about what is it about leaf morphology or leaf persistence that is part of this story. And I'll save that for another time, but I'll tell you about the DNA sequence data. So let me set this up for you. We now know, and this is relatively recent, that there are unambiguous pollen grain fossils that are 50 million years up at high latitude for the modern oaks, white oak and red oak pollen, way up high latitude. That's pretty amazing to think about our temperate plant ancestors being at high latitude. BLB refers to the Bering Land Bridge, NALB refers to the North Atlantic Land Bridge, just a couple of markers there that most people think about with respect to migration. Just an aside, those red dots are where the fossils are. On the left is the evolutionary tree that we've constructed from our DNA sequence data using a pretty good sample. White oaks on top, red oaks below. I'm going to walk you through this cartoon because it's kind of fun. So the first thing we see in blue are that the groups in California are the first branch in each one of these groups, the red oaks and the white oaks. The Eastern North American oaks sort of fill in the middle ground in both groups, white oaks and red oaks. And finally, the Mexican and adjacent area groups are the next group to branch off, totally in parallel, reds and whites, sort of coming through this evolutionary history as we've reconstructed it. So to put some words and a couple of cartoons to that, we've got a clear case that there was an early divergence between West and East in both parts of this evolutionary history. A little bit of speciation in Western and Eastern North America, and then a lot of speciation. In fact, it looks like there was an uptick in speciation when the oaks started to get into Central America about 15 million years ago. This is all done through some algorithms and some analyses of the sequence data. I'm not going to share those details with you, but I'll tell you that the reasons for this have something to do with the geological history of Mexico and adjacent areas. A hot spot for recent change, mountain building, volcanics, creating all sorts of seasonal habitats in this montane setting where oaks are at their happiest. Seasonal climates on the sides of mountains in Mexico and in Central America. So we built the tree of life for the oaks, and we're really proud of it. It's a time tree, so we used fossils to calibrate this time tree to sort of make it real in a sense that the splitting times would be accurate with what the fossils can do for that kind of analysis. So on the left are sort of the deeper branches in a time tree. So this is going back. So we're going back to about 56 million years on the left. The warmer colors are these hot spots of speciation that were detected using several different analytical tools. The big arrows are the red oaks and the white oaks. And we also detected two more little bursts of speciation, one in the Eurasian white oaks and one in the tropical oaks in Southeast Asia. So there's 4 bursts of speciation, according to this analysis, that explains this pulse of oak diversity within the last 15 million years. They're all on the same line. That's exactly the time. So it's a contemporaneous, coincident kind of pattern that we detected. And we're pretty excited about that. So this is the oak tree of life showing those with a pretty good sample of oak diversity. We don't have every species here, but we have a really good sample of the oaks of the world.
How long did it take to do that?
Probably about 5 years. So ecosystem services is a term tossed around a lot to think about the impact of particular groups of organisms on the things we care about, on the health of the system, on the interactions, on productivity. All sorts of aspects are captured. Even monetary aspects can be put to ecosystem services. And it turns out that, yes, Quercus, the big winners with respect to estimates of total biomass here in the US and also in Mexico relative to Pinus and some other genera, and species richness, just the number of species, and that's higher than any of those groups. So the oaks seem to have this dominant role in the ecologies of the temperate zone in at least the Americas. So it's really interesting to think about that because we now realize that there's so much to some of the things that happen just every fall. And that might mean the dropping of a lot of acorns. And we call those mass years. We can't predict them very well. They're based on environmental cues. But the idea that they're synchronized in some kind of way, that they produce these large numbers of fruits, this is really now known to be the huge sort of, I guess, the big impact in forest restoration and recruitment. It's about the massed years more than anything else. Because in your average years, those acorns are, the pathogens are getting them, The squirrels are getting them. But in the big years, some of them make it through. And that's what masting is all about. This is more well studied than before, and it's kind of interesting. For us, if we think about oaks and their role in the ecology, it looks like it is one amazing food web to consider, especially on a mast year, where we know that acorns are being consumed by deer, mice are going to have an impact if their populations get big. We're going to feel the effects of ticks carrying Lyme disease. And during the lean years, we're going to see some other downstream consequences. So it's really important to think about the role of oaks. Hickories are playing a role in this as well, as are some other tree crops, but oaks are clearly defining a lot of these food web dynamics. Making a plug here for Matt Candeas. If any of you listen to In Defense of Plants, Matt does a great job with laying down why we all need to get over plant blindness. I don't think anyone here is plant blind, so tell your friends that need to really join forces with Matt and the rest of us in starting to think about plants more often. It's been a big year for oak books. There's a great book more on the technical side called Oak Seed Dispersal by Michael Steele, who's put all of his research together into explaining the dynamics of foraging on the animal perspective of acorns. So really interesting that that book has just culminated so much of what we always thought about. Why are squirrels so choosy? What is it that drives their preference? How do they fool other organisms out there? A lot of interesting stuff. But the important thing for me is to think about this innovation of what we have with an acorn. And it comes down to the fact that we now know that there's a burst of speciation in the oak family associated with this trait we call hypogeous cotyledons. It really translates into underground first leaves. Inside these nutshells are the first leaves. They're modified storage organs. These are second leaves that are up here on the shoot, and here's the root. So hypogeous cotyledons, this is not just about Quercus. Hickories do this, and some other groups do as well. But the oaks have really taken this trait and run with it. And here's what those look like if you capture them at the right moment. Move the duff off these germinating acorns. And you can see that these are the leaves. They're full of tannins and all sorts of chemistry, but they've successfully made it through the filter of whatever those herbivores are sort of discovering. So here are those modified leaves and those shoots. So the idea here is that if any of these shoots are damaged by a herbivore, there's so much resource left in these first leaves, it can put up another shoot. I've seen roots come off of these first leaves. They are really the power of acorns beyond the typical looking shoot root dynamics. So it's an interesting thing to consider just how much extra resources might be part of restoration in forest dynamics. And here are the mutualists that have been working with oaks for a really long time. We've got squirrels, we've got blue jays. We might have had the passenger pigeon when it was still a living species. And on the right, my favorite is the acorn woodpecker. And this is a Western Mexico phenomenon. These woodpeckers drill holes in trees or telephone poles and stick acorns in them. And this is their granary. They use these acorns later, but as they're doing it, they get a little sloppy and these acorns fall and they're good dispersers. In fact, the distribution of the acorn woodpecker matches exactly with the distribution of Quercus in Western North America and in Mexico. So this is a coevolution that is really pretty impressive. So a couple of pictures of these guys to do them justice. Beautiful birds. Those two on top are not my picture, but the one below is, and I found this on the ground, and it's just great to see these holes that might have held acorns at some point. So pretty impressive. Blue jays are doing a lot of work. And if someone finds oaks out in the middle of a field and they didn't see any squirrels there, it's blue jays, no doubt. So these birds can move multiple nuts at a time, drop them, do all sorts of things, and disperse oaks. And this is a long-term association as well. And the distribution matches pretty well with Eastern North America, where there's plenty of oak species. So it gets even better for oaks. They've got all the advantages of having organisms work for them to bring their seeds around. These are long histories of coevolution, these ancient partnerships, and it continues underground. So another partnership, ectomycorrhizal fungi that live on the roots of oaks. These fungi are out foraging for resources. They bring them back to the plant. The plant gives them photosynthase. It's a beautiful story. Russula is one of the main contributors to this. There are others. It's a whole happy guild of different fungi, mushroom-forming fungi that do this. Only 10% of the seed plant families are involved in ectomycorrhizal symbiosis. This is a very special form. The pines do it as well, and the oaks, and a few others. But this is really a unique symbiosis. These are the roots covered with fungal sheaths to just give you that swollen look where the surfaces have expanded, the surface contact with the soil. It's really a wonderful thing to think about, is just how old this is. And it's pretty old to begin with, because it probably started with gymnosperms or conifers and then shifted to oaks. And there's been a lot of talk of what's really going on underground, and a lot of it well-intended, and a lot of it just maybe a little too much storytelling. But overall, the idea that there's one single organism under there, fungi and oak roots, for example, just working together in a cooperative, it's an incredible idea about what's happening that we really didn't understand very well until recently. So the Wood Wide Web has some reality. It's been taken to some places that we can all judge for ourselves, but generally this is an interesting phenomenon. So what I wanted to do in this middle section is just set up the idea that the oaks seem to be having more interactions than just about any other tree genus in the North America, at least, and probably the same throughout temperate Eurasia. Long evolutionary history, lots of diversity, big ranges. Some of the ranges are ridiculous. I put Quercus alba here just to show you how widespread white oak is. I mean, it's really covering a lot of ground. Dominance, made that point, high fecundity, lots of physiological adaptations to be in different growth zones. Really good at drought. Not so good with fire, but they try their best. Mutualistic lifestyles, biotic interactions, and then probably the kicker is that this idea that these long-lived plants and their big populations have a lot of genetic variability. And the icing on the cake is that the oaks expand that variability by hybridizing with other species. And so the envelope is sort of wide open for oaks in terms of their ability to be variable and then to embrace variability from other species that may be adaptively valuable. And we did that in our history as well. We all have 2 to 3% Neanderthal in us. It must have been the good stuff that's stuck in our genome, adaptively valuable. The same thing is happening in Quercus. I have some reasonable evidence about that, not quite as clear as what's been shown with Neanderthals and humans. So as I said, a big year for books. This is a great book if you haven't read it. Doug Ptolemy does a wonderful job of making the point of the associated herbivores that live in oak forests. He's got a wonderful way of putting this diversity into context for anybody. He really speaks to the public really well about this diversity and its importance, especially at botanical gardens or along city streets. Why planting oaks is really just so much more ecologically progressive than putting anything else in the ground. So Doug has done a great job, and caterpillars are really the heart of it. And he has the data to show that oaks are supporting close to 900 species of caterpillars in the US. This is a post oak. from Green Street in Durham. It's just a wonderful open grown post oak, but I also like the way oaks look without leaves. And interestingly, Doug has evidence that there are caterpillar larvae that are here in winter condition as well. And our birds are picking them out. We can't really pick them out very easily when we see them, but those larvae are there and birds know where to find them. So even in the winter condition, these oaks are contributing to ecosystem services. So I'm going to change gears a little bit. We're at Duke now, and this is Duke Gardens. And we're looking at an oak that's been perplexing a lot of people for a long time. It's got a nice fully developed crown. It's probably about 80 years old. And I started looking at it along with all the keepers of Duke Gardens who've been puzzled by it. And so here's what its morphology is all about. It's this stuff here, and growing with it is Quercus fellows, and here's the fruit. And here's Quercus rubra that's nearby. And this is the last bit of what looks like forested part of Duke Gardens, the last bit of it before everything sort of turned into more of a planned intentional garden. So we've got the intermediate here, and this is leading me to think about the impact of hybridization in Quercus. So that is a Bartram oak that we were looking at, and Bartram oaks have been described for a while. They're kind of a one-off. It seems like William Bartram and found one near his estate, made a lot of it. It's called Quercus heterophylla. It's a hybrid, but the parentage wasn't always clear. But this was a pretty good guess. Willow oak from Penn State, Jim Hardin, published in the 70s. Jim Hardin studied herbarium specimens, and he wanted to show that Quercus alba had this central role in connecting to a lot of different species. So these networks were produced pretty widely back in the day. All sorts of, thick lines meant a lot of interaction, thinner lines meant less so. But this is sort of the scorecard of how Quercus alba and related white oaks were swapping genes just based on morphology using herbarium specimens. On the left, just giving you an indication of this intermediacy that we see in other combinations of oak parentage. And then on the right, I found this when, I might have been like 21 years old. Large acorn, small acorn. This is Quercus ilicifolia, the bare oak on the right, red oak on the left, and a wonderful fruit intermediate. This was up on a ridge top in New Jersey. So right down to the fruit level, you might get intermediacy if the parents are that different. And of course, the leaves are just sort of what vexes people when they're out in nature looking at oaks. So that's all clear. But we're going to take a short field trip. We're going to go out west for this last vignette to bring you the most recent bit of biodiversity that's been named in Quercus for the US. And it's called Quercus parvula variety tamalpaicensis. We call it the Tamalpais oak or the Mount Tam oak. And we can see that we're looking at the Golden Gate. And up in here, the Marin Headlands is where Mount Tam is. And we go to the right, you can see Mount Tam, here's San Francisco, Oaklandia over here, Berkeley, and so forth. So that's our setting to think about the origin of this oak. It's got a funny morphology. It makes really big leaves. And that's part of this mystique of this oak was, if you can look, there aren't many oaks out west that make leaves this big. So this thing looked unusual. I'm going to bring you into the whole story of the red oaks out west. And so just consider that the California black oak looks a lot like our red oak. They have one of those out there, classic deciduous red oak. They also have Quercus wislezeni and Quercus parvula. These are evergreen oaks. And then they also have Quercus agrifolia, the coastal live oak out there. So those are the constituent species. And then they've got hybrids. And California loves to name its biodiversity. So these hybrids have all been named, and they're wonderfully intermediate. Here's Quercus tamalpaicensis. It is in blue because it's been associated with Quercus parvula. I'm just putting that out there as the taxonomy right now. But one thing you should be aware of is that if you got deciduous and evergreen oaks hybridizing, the progeny are going to be half deciduous and half evergreen. And you can see this at 60 miles an hour. So the hybrids are visible, really obvious in their, often in disturbed zones on the roadsides. So there is the intermediate with its half evergreen leaf. We just don't have that here, but it's pretty cool out west. So that's part of the story. We'll look at some distributions. These are those oaks in their classic California cismontane distributions. So you can see the colors, everything's color coded for you. We've got Wislizeni, we've got Parvula, we've got Agrifolia, we've got Kelagii, some of the samples we've used in this study. And then I want to introduce you to a citizen scientist who worked on this project and a geology major named Duncan who came into my lab to work as a part-time technician. Here's the characters there. And the question is, what about this tam oak? Does it really fit in where the taxonomist wanted it to be, or is there something more to it? So I'll give you the full story here. Now, the citizen scientist was a retired Volvo mechanic. He really was into precision. And we wanted to have a little taxonomic component to this just because, we didn't want it to be all DNA. So there was morphometrics and a lot of sophisticated measurements going on. And Al and one of his friends made the oak gauge, where you can put nuts in there and get their measurements exactly at 6 millimeters from the apex. So this is the pinnacle of taxonomy. I just wanted you guys to all see that. So here we are. Alan, you've got it. So Al as our citizen scientist, wonderful person. And here it is in application. The two toughest of the complex to tell apart, Parvula and Wislizeni, two features. The apex trait works really well. You can see the blunt versus the more acute apex. And then just one more trait. The cup scar inside the cup is different in these two species. So this is really nice because these are hard to key out. You want to give taxonomists or botanists something to handle besides sort of like, oh, go look at the DNA results. So this is part of the story, but just a little aside just to get you to think about it. So back to Mount Tam. Our sampling was pretty comprehensive. We were sampling from near the type location of Mount Tam oak, and of course, adjacent areas of California, all over the top of the mountain here. So pretty good sampling. And now don't be scared, I'm gonna walk you through this. So this is another phylogenetic tree of the oaks, fully color-coded, the same colors that I started with. And I'll just walk you through it. There's two analyses here. The one on the left is the phylogenetic analysis. The one on the right is an analysis to look for genetic mixing. And that's all you need to know. So what did we discover? Well, the California black oak, the deciduous one, is outside. It's the sister to all the rest. That's great. We also found out that our hybrids were wonderfully intermediate with this DNA technology. We could pull them out 50-50. Look at the colors, it's just great. We also found out that there was a group here of Parvula and Wislizeni being sister, closest relative to Agrifolia. That was great too. But I wanted to focus you right in on the secondary analysis we did, where it looks like this group in purple and blue had some extra variation that needed to be explained. And what it showed is that the samples from Mount Tam were admixed between those two species, Parvula and Wislizeni. So Mount Tam oak, at least here from this analysis, looks to be something like a stabilized hybrid. We don't have any evidence in all of our studies of anything that looks like a stabilized hybrid species. So this is one of those cases where this little population looks like a leftover by those two parental species, which don't occur there. just that mix of a 70-30 kind of hybrid entity. So I think we upset some people in California who didn't want to know it was a hybrid. They wanted it to be just sort of a variety of Quercus parvula, but now it looks like it's more Wislazeni than parvula. So I'm happy I'm not out there right now because it's just what it is. How about explaining the large leaf type? This was what the Californians were worried about, is that they thought California black oak was a partner here because it has a big leaf. We didn't find any evidence of that. So it looks like in the literature, this idea that some hybrids actually look anomalously large compared to their parents. That's been reported in the literature. We've seen it in plant domestication literature. So there is something to that, and we call that transgressive segregation, that the hybrid is not intermediate, it's actually more of a monstrosity. So Mount Tam might measure up to those standards. Here's some of the specimens, just so you get a look at this Mount Tam oak. Here was exactly the type location. There's the type specimen, and we were sampling all around it on this interesting slope on Mount Tam. So I'm going to close out that, just give you a look at Mount Tam and the oak. And I'm closing up here with just a few final thoughts on the oaks of the world. So when we built that evolutionary tree of all the oaks of the world, we found that one group, we could put a name on it and call it subgenus Quercus. These are the American oaks. I'm going to just walk through very lightly here. These are the red and black oaks. They're endemic to the New World, the Americas. Protobalanus, the golden oaks out here, endemic to the West. The deer oak, we've got one. The other one is in the Caucasus Mountains. This was a discovery of ours. They couldn't be any further apart. When we looked at the data for their bioclimate data, it's spot on. Whatever is in the Caucasus and the Siskiyou Mountains of Northern California is about the same climate. These are two leftovers, relictual species of probably a more widespread group that's down to just two things. They split about 12 million years ago. Coastal live, we all appreciate that distribution, one of the more non-montane groups of oaks that are out there on the landscape to appreciate. They're often in sand or volcanic soils. And then the big winners, the white oaks. They're in the New World, they're in the Old World, 150 species total. That's the biggest group of oaks. We'll still call them American oaks because we now know that the European group came from an American ancestry and went over there. So one thing we now know is that there was ancient hybridization when some of these oak groups came into contact, and we think that it's adaptive. So the same story about us and our Neanderthal friends. Oaks share bits of genomes that seem to be adaptively valuable. Two examples, the live oaks and the white oaks in North America have shared some genetic material, and it's maintained in each of their genomes. And this is the strange one. That remnant species, Quercus pontica, hybridized with the Eurasian white oaks. All of the Eurasian white oaks, about 20 species, have that genomic shared quality. So in a sense, maybe this interaction is part of how this group of white oaks that spread throughout Eurasia just became so successful in their migration from Western Europe all the way to Japan. A little bit of storytelling there, but I think it's a good one. Okay, so to wrap it up, we know that hybridization is common in the oaks, but the species do not seem to be of hybrid origin. I gave you one case study out of looking at all of our oaks in North America. None of them have shown that profile, but it could be that certain populations we haven't studied might indicate a similar history of a stabilized leftover between a hybridization act in the past. Despite leaky species boundaries, the oaks mostly have diverged from one another in evolutionary time. The hybrids are fertile. They seem to form narrow genetic bridges between species, and it's another resource to expand the envelope of what's in their genome to take on future challenges. So that's probably a very good adaptive quality of the oaks. This idea of an open genome is becoming more and more common. We think about it with respect to corals. There's a lot of other species that seem to have hybridization as part of their biology. So divergence with gene flow is a pretty strong message now. We're getting away from the zoocentric approach to recognizing species, finally. There's a new paradigm about species. They've got evolutionary potential, and hybridization is part of that. And that's sort of where we're going with respect to what's happening with climate change and landscape change. Good news for us is we've got a project that's focused on this very topic, and it just started. And our interest is, with this great team of folks that we put together, is what are the functional consequences of hybridization, especially with respect to all of the interactants with oaks. What about their ectomycorrhizal fungi? What about the fungi in their leaves? What about the gall wasps that are on their leaves? How does that affect their spectral qualities with respect to the leaves? A range of things with some experimental biology as well, and we're just taking off with that. So with that, I'm going to close, and I really appreciate all your attention. Thanks so much. Yeah, so the question is, why do oaks and beeches hold on to their leaves during the winter? Great question. It's the question that is asked of me the most, and probably some of you other folks who are in the garden business. And there's a few answers. I'll give you the one that I think might be an adaptive answer. And it's that holding on to these leaves, especially in younger trees, and you usually see this in younger trees, not in really older individuals, those leaves become very dried down to the essence of whatever didn't get reabsorbed by the parent plant. There are no microbes up there to sort of take the rest of what's in those dried leaves, as opposed to what's going on in the soil, where the microbes are feasting on the leaves during the winter season, grabbing everything they can. So fast forward to spring, when the oaks and the beeches are ready to start going with the spring flush. It turns out dropping those dried leaves might give them a little burst of whatever is in those leaves, essential minerals, to get them through that tough patch where they're still competing with microbes for the rest of what's in the leaves that are in the litter. So that's one adaptive explanation. There are others for other species that hold on to their leaves, but I think that's what I've read in one paper on the topic. Happy to open that up to anyone else who has a comment about it. The trait is called marcescence. So these are marcescent oaks and beeches that hold on to their leaves. So the question is, how are divergence times estimated? And what's the role of fossils in that approximation? And is there some variance around that? And so the answer is that there's plenty of variance around that. It's really a ballpark approach. The fossils play a role of providing sort of constraints in the construction of the tree. And the algorithm works to take advantage of the divergence, the amount of divergence between the lineages. So it works together with the fossils, and it's a pretty routine approach. The estimations have some error bars around them. So we're in a ballpark zone of saying 15 to 20 million years. Some grains of salt for sure with that kind of approach. Can't be exact, just roughly so. But it is generally considered that we're now adjusting with the particular algorithms that are used for the idea that the molecular clock doesn't tick the same across lineages. So that's part of this as well, is that assuming everything is clock-like is also not correct. So these approaches embrace the idea that you're going to have different rates of change across the tree. So they've gotten better and better. And with fossils, you end up constraining the possibilities. And that's as good as you can get. And it's great to have fossils. And the Quercus fossil record is pretty rich. It's a challenge if you don't have fossil record for a particular group to do that. You would rely on even more inexact approaches without fossils. What are the environmental cues for massed years, and are they applied across certain groups of plants? And oaks and hickories are wind pollinated. So a good spring for wind pollination is a series of drier, windy days without rain during the period when the anthers are shedding their pollen. So there's other factors, but that's number one, is that you would have a good spring. The other part of this is, even if pollination was good, if plants have been going through years of stress, fruit production may not be something they've ready to invest in. So going from solid, great pollination biology to fruit set is another set of variables. So just imagine multiple years of drought and trees weakened generally. They might abort a lot of their fruit. So we're probably talking about the coincidence of multiple factors to bring across a good solid mast year in hickories and oaks. Some of masting tends to be local to regional as opposed to really broad. And so there might be pockets of solid masting based on different weather patterns and the health of certain forests relative to the whole. And so there may be a lot there. I'm not studying it to know much more, but I can tell you that it seems to be pretty obvious when it's a great regional mast year. And I think last fall was not a great year. Anyone have any reflections on last year's acorns? None? Year before, better? Yeah. So things like that.
Can you speculate on the consequences of sudden oak death?
No, not really. The issue is there is a new disease in California, and the question is, will it come east? This is a Phytophthora species. I believe this is not a fungus, it's a water mold. Am I right there? Anyone? I think. So anyway, the idea of it coming east has been, speculated upon. I don't think we've seen it. The real challenge is that the disease has alternate hosts, so it's not just an oak disease. It's also on Ericaceae, where it doesn't cause severe symptoms. So kind of like the chestnut blight, you can't get rid of the disease because it's still in the forest on other plants, that it doesn't damage as much. Oaks are the alternate host for chestnut blight. It just doesn't really bother them that much. So we can't get rid of the disease from our forest. So I think the story in California is it's kind of an endemic disease right now, but I don't know where it's going. So not expert enough as a pathologist to say. Well, I know that gall wasps will lay their eggs almost on any part of the plant, buds, early flowers, leaves. They cause a reaction, a hormonal reaction, that the plant responds with sort of an anomalous bit of growth to make the gall or something else. It could be that the curling of leaves is evidence of that, but there's a lot of diseases out there. And I would say that the NC State site for forest pathogens is a much better resource than I am.
Well, let's give it up for Paul. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thanks, everyone.
So I'm going to borrow from a Chinese proverb. The best time to plant an oak is 20 years ago. The next best time is today. All right. Remember that. So Thank you all for joining us here and on Zoom. If you're not currently a member, we hope you will consider becoming a member. Membership is critical to our mission. So for those of you on Zoom, check out the links in the chat. And next, February 12th is on Sunday. So we're going to be sucking away so many viewers from the Super Bowl. It's going to be amazing. So watch out. So, okay, thank you for coming, and we'll see you next year.